Dr. Sarah Mitchell's hands froze mid-stitch as the radio crackled to life, her surgical needle suspended over the sedated elephant calf. Emergency at Grid 77. Lion trapped in plastic container. Day 5 without food or water. The coordinates weren't random wildlife coordinates. They matched Derek Morrison's GPS logs from her investigation file. Her assistant Maria dropped the medical tray, instruments scattering across the dirt floor with metallic clangs that echoed through the makeshift field hospital. 2 tourists in the observation area gasped audibly, hands flying to cover their mouths. Sarah's mind raced back to the missing person report filed 3 days ago. An American man who'd been asking locals about the lion that killed children. She'd dismissed it as another grief-stricken parent chasing ghosts across Africa. "Get the emergency surgical kit and call the helicopter," she commanded, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Inside, a cold dread settled in her stomach. What kind of monster traps a dying animal and waits? And how long before they find a body instead of a rescue? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Masai Mara stretched endlessly under the September sun, its golden grasslands shimmering like molten amber in the 95-degree heat. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had called this unforgiving paradise home for 8 years, trading her comfortable Boston veterinary practice for a canvas tent and the daily struggle to save Africa's disappearing wildlife. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared death in the face too many times to count, her weathered hands bearing the scars of countless emergency surgeries performed under acacia trees. The Kenya Wildlife Service Medical Center sat like a small fortress against the vast savanna, its solar panels glinting in the relentless African sun. Here, Sarah had pioneered mobile surgical techniques that had saved over 300 animals, earning her the nickname the Lion Whisperer among local Maasai communities. Her reputation for taking impossible cases had spread across East Africa, but it came at a personal cost. Her marriage had crumbled under the weight of her obsession with her work, and her 2 children, Jennifer and Thomas, now grown and living their own lives in America, rarely called. 8 miles away, in a luxury safari lodge overlooking the Mara River, Derek Morrison sat alone on his private balcony, watching the sun paint the horizon in shades of orange and red. The 58-year-old retired insurance executive from Denver looked nothing like the successful businessman he'd once been. His graying hair hung unkempt, his expensive safari clothes wrinkled from days of wear, and his hands shook slightly as he lifted his whiskey glass, his 3rd of the evening. The presidential suite, costing $800 a night, felt like a prison cell decorated with African art and zebra print cushions. Morrison's journey to this moment had begun 15 years earlier with a phone call that shattered his world. His 8-year-old son Michael had died during what should have been the adventure of a lifetime, a family safari in Botswana. The official report spoke of cardiac arrest, a rare genetic condition that struck without warning, but grief had warped Morrison's memory into something darker. In his mind, the lions circling their vehicle that day had become predators, and one lion in particular, a massive male with a distinctive black mane, had become the focus of his obsession. He'd spent his retirement savings, $400,000, tracking that specific lion across 3 countries. His wife Helen had left him 3 years ago, unable to watch the man she loved disappear into a spiral of revenge and alcohol. "You're chasing ghosts, Derek," she'd said during their final argument. "Michael died of a heart condition, not a lion attack." "When will you accept that?" But acceptance felt like betrayal. Every morning, Morrison woke to Michael's photo on his nightstand, a gap-toothed smile frozen in time, and renewed his promise to the boy who would never grow up. Tonight, that promise was finally within reach. Hidden in his luggage was the modified plastic container that would serve as his instrument of justice. Tomorrow, he would drive to the coordinates he'd spent months identifying, and the lion that haunted his dreams would finally pay for taking his son's life. Neither Sarah nor Derek knew that their paths were about to collide in the most extraordinary way possible. The pre-dawn darkness of September 15th wrapped around Derek Morrison like a burial shroud as he loaded the modified gallon jug into his rented Land Rover. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from 15 years of suppressed rage finally finding its release. The industrial adhesive he'd purchased from a Nairobi hardware store gleamed wetly inside the container's mouth, a spider's web designed for one specific prey. He'd spent 6 months studying Kiboko's patterns, learning the magnificent lion's daily routes through patient observation and generous bribes to local guides. The 30-minute drive to the remote watering hole passed in a blur of acacia trees and red dirt roads. Morrison's mind drifted to that terrible day in Botswana when everything changed. He could still hear Michael's excited voice, "Daddy, look at the big kitty!" The boy had pressed his face against the safari vehicle's window, eyes wide with wonder at the pride of lions lounging beneath a baobab tree. Minutes later, Michael had collapsed, his small heart simply stopping as if someone had flipped a switch. The doctors had explained it clinically: hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a genetic time bomb that could have exploded at any moment. But Morrison's grief-stricken mind had rewritten the narrative. The lions had scared his son to death. They were killers, and the largest male with the black mane had looked directly at Michael before the boy's heart failed. In Morrison's fractured memory, that look had become a death sentence. At 4:30 a.m., Morrison reached the coordinates he'd memorized. 1D23s, 34DG58. E. The watering hole, reduced to a muddy depression by the dry season, would draw Kiboko here within hours. Morrison's surveillance had confirmed the lion's routine. First light brought the pride to drink before the heat became unbearable. He positioned the jug carefully beside the water, its opening precisely 4.2 inches in diameter, calculated to accommodate an adult male lion's head, but prevent withdrawal once the adhesive activated. The rotting meat he'd placed inside would mask any human scent and draw Kiboko's curiosity. Morrison had learned from his research that lions investigated new smells thoroughly, often testing them with their tongues before committing to a full investigation. The adhesive would bond instantly with saliva and fur, creating an unbreakable seal. As he worked, Morrison found himself talking to Michael's memory. "Almost over, buddy. Daddy's going to make the bad lion pay for what he did to you." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his voice. Helen's accusations echoed in his mind. "You're not seeking justice, Derek. You're seeking someone to blame because you can't blame God." At 6:15 a.m., the thunderous sound of approaching paws made Morrison's heart race. He retreated to his observation post 400 yards away, binoculars ready. Through the morning mist, Kiboko emerged like something from a prehistoric dream. 8 years old and 420 pounds of pure muscle, the lion moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator in his prime. His black mane, shot through with silver, caught the early sunlight like a crown. Behind Kiboko came his small pride, 4 lionesses and 3 cubs, their golden forms ghost-like in the dawn light. Morrison watched as the pride approached the water cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The lionesses drank first while Kiboko stood guard, his amber eyes scanning the horizon for threats. Then, inevitably, the lion noticed the jug. Morrison's breath caught as Kiboko approached the strange object, nostrils flaring to catch its scent. The lion circled it twice, demonstrating the intelligence that had kept him alive in one of Africa's most competitive ecosystems. For a moment, Morrison thought Kiboko might reject the bait entirely. But hunger won. The pride hadn't made a successful kill in 3 days, and the scent of meat, however tainted, triggered Kiboko's predatory instincts. The lion lowered his massive head, investigating the jug's opening with his tongue. The adhesive activated instantly. What followed was the most horrifying minute of Morrison's life. Kiboko's roar of panic shattered the morning calm, sending birds exploding from nearby trees in terror. The lion's powerful neck muscles strained against the unyielding plastic, but the industrial adhesive held firm. His attempts to claw at the jug only drove it deeper, the plastic cutting into his neck fur and drawing blood. The pride's reaction was heartbreaking to witness. The lionesses circled their leader, roaring their distress and confusion. One female, whom local rangers called Janai, attempted to grab the jug with her teeth, but Kiboko's frantic movements made it impossible. The cubs mewed in terror, sensing their father's panic without understanding its source. For 2 agonizing hours, the pride tried everything to free their leader. They pushed against him, pulled at the jug, and roared their frustration to the empty sky. But survival instinct eventually overruled loyalty. With hyenas already gathering at the scent of distress, Janai made the impossible decision that would haunt Morrison's dreams. She led the pride away, leaving Kiboko to his fate. Morrison watched through his binoculars as the lion he'd hunted for 15 years was abandoned by his own family. And for the first time since Michael's death, he felt something other than rage. He felt shame. The call came to Dr. Sarah Mitchell at 3:20 p.m. on September 17th, cutting through her concentration as she sutured a gash on an injured zebra's flank. James Patterson, a wildlife photographer from Minneapolis, spoke in rapid, breathless sentences that initially made Sarah question his sobriety. "Doctor, you have to listen to me. There's a lion out here, and he's got some kind of container stuck on his head. He's been wandering for days, and he looks like he's dying." Sarah's first instinct was skepticism. In 8 years of wildlife rescue, she'd received dozens of calls from well-meaning tourists who mistook normal animal behavior for emergencies. Lions resting in shade became unconscious, and playful cubs became abandoned orphans. But something in Patterson's voice, a tremor of genuine distress, made her pause her work. "Sir, can you describe exactly what you're seeing?" Sarah asked, pulling off her surgical gloves and reaching for a notepad. "It's a male lion, huge, with a black mane. He's got what looks like a milk jug or a water container completely covering his head. The plastic is clear, but I can see blood around his neck where it's cutting into him. Doctor, he's just wandering in circles, bumping into trees. I think he's blind and probably can't eat or drink." The GPS coordinates Patterson provided sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The location was remote, rarely visited by tourists, and more importantly, it matched reports from local Maasai herders about an American man asking suspicious questions about lion movements in that exact area. 3 days earlier, the Kenya Wildlife Service had received an inquiry about a missing person, a tourist who had failed to return to his lodge. Sarah's mind raced back to her father's final battle with cancer 5 years earlier. Thomas Mitchell had fought for 2 years, never giving up even when doctors offered no hope. "Every life has value, period," he told her during one of their last conversations. "The moment we start deciding who deserves to be saved and who doesn't, we lose our humanity." The memory crystallized her decision. "James, I need you to mark your exact location and stay with the animal if it's safe to do so. Don't approach him, but keep visual contact. I'm mobilizing a rescue team immediately." Her next call was to Samuel Kiptoo, the most experienced animal tracker in the Mara region. A man of few words but extraordinary skill, Samuel could read animal behavior like others read newspapers. His calm voice carried weight when he confirmed Patterson's description. "Dr. Sarah, I know this lion. The Maasai call him Kiboko, the protector. He once stood between a charging buffalo and a lost child. If he is suffering, it is not by choice. The Kenya Wildlife Service's emergency budget was already strained beyond capacity. Sarah's last 3 major rescues had cost the organization nearly $60,000, leading to heated board meetings where bureaucrats questioned her emotional decision-making. Her supervisor, Dr. Robert Kamani, had been explicit. "Sarah, we cannot save every animal. We must focus our resources on conservation priorities, not individual cases." But Sarah had never learned to calculate the value of suffering. As she assembled her emergency team, 2 rangers, her veterinary assistant Maria Santos and Samuel, she knew she was risking her career for a lion she'd never seen. Her daughter Jennifer's words from their last phone call echoed in her mind. "Mom, you're doing it again. You're risking everything for work that doesn't appreciate you." The rescue team departed at 4:45 p.m. in 2 vehicles loaded with emergency medical supplies, tranquilizer equipment, and portable surgical tools. The drive through the Mara's back roads was punishing, 90 minutes of bone-jarring terrain that tested both vehicles and nerves. Sarah used the time to study everything she could about emergency procedures for removing foreign objects from large predators. But nothing in her veterinary training had prepared her for this scenario. When they reached Patterson's coordinates, the scene that greeted them was heartbreaking beyond Sarah's worst imaginings. Kiboko lay beneath a solitary acacia tree, his massive frame reduced to skin and bones after 3 days without food or water. The clear plastic container covering his head was streaked with blood and saliva, and his breathing was shallow and labored. His body temperature, measured from a safe distance with an infrared thermometer, registered 107 degrees Fahrenheit, well into the danger zone for hyperthermia. "My God," Maria whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "How is he still alive?" Samuel approached slowly, reading the tracks around the area with the expertise of a lifetime spent in the bush. His findings painted a tragic picture. The pride was here for many hours. They tried to help him, but survival forced them to leave. You can see where the cubs waited longest, there by those rocks. They did not want to abandon their father. The technical challenge before them was unprecedented. The plastic container appeared to be bonded to Kiboko's neck, fur, and skin with some kind of industrial adhesive. Traditional tranquilization carried enormous risk. Respiratory depression could kill an animal already weakened by dehydration and heat stress. But attempting to remove the container while the lion was conscious was equally dangerous. As Sarah examined the situation, a white Land Rover appeared on the horizon, approaching their location. Behind the wheel sat Derek Morrison, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. For 3 days, he had shadowed the rescue efforts, torn between his desire for revenge and the growing horror of watching his trap's effects. Morrison parked his vehicle 50 yards away and approached the rescue team with his hands clearly visible. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Doctor, I need to tell you something about that lion and about how he got that container on his head." Sarah turned to face the stranger, noting his haunted expression and trembling hands. In that moment, she realized that saving Kiboko would require more than medical expertise. It would demand understanding the human tragedy that had led to this moment. "Sir, we're conducting an emergency rescue operation. If you have information relevant to this animal's condition, we need to hear it now." Morrison's confession would change everything they thought they knew about this rescue mission. Derek Morrison's confession came in broken fragments, each word seeming to tear pieces from his soul. "My name is Derek Morrison. I'm from Denver, Colorado, and I'm the one who put that container on the lion's head." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. Her first instinct was fury, pure, white-hot rage at the man who had caused such unnecessary suffering. But as Morrison continued speaking, his voice barely above a whisper, the simple narrative of cruelty began to unravel into something far more complex. 15 years ago, that lion killed my 8-year-old son. Michael was everything to me, and I've spent every day since then tracking the animal that took him away. Samuel stepped forward, his weathered hand moving instinctively toward the radio to call for police backup, but Sarah raised her hand to stop him. Something in Morrison's demeanor, the way his shoulders shook, the tears streaming down his weathered face, suggested this wasn't a man celebrating his victory. This was a man confronting the wreckage of his own choices. "I thought it would feel different," Morrison continued, his voice breaking. "I thought when I finally got my revenge, I'd feel satisfied. But watching him suffer for 3 days, seeing his family abandon him." He looked at Kiboko's unconscious form beneath the acacia tree. "All I feel is sick." The rescue team worked with grim efficiency while Morrison's story unfolded. Maria prepared IV fluids while Samuel cleared a surgical area, but Sarah found herself listening with the fascination of someone watching a man dissect his own heart. Morrison described 15 years of obsession, $400,000 of retirement savings spent on tracking equipment and guide fees, a marriage destroyed by grief that had calcified into hatred. "My wife Helen left me 3 years ago," Morrison said, sitting heavily on a fallen log. "She kept trying to tell me that Michael died of a heart condition, that the medical examiner's report was clear. But I knew what I saw. That lion looked right at Michael before my boy collapsed. I know it sounds crazy, but animals can sense weakness, can't they? They know when to strike." Sarah had seen enough grief in her years as a veterinarian to recognize the signs of what psychologists called complicated mourning. Grief that becomes pathological, transforming love into something destructive. Morrison's fixation on Kiboko wasn't really about justice. It was about having a target for pain that had nowhere else to go. As they worked to prepare Kiboko for emergency surgery, Morrison made an offer that stunned everyone present. "I have a helicopter standing by in Nairobi. Medical transport, fully equipped surgical suite. Cost me $50,000 to arrange, but it's ready to fly. If you think it might help save him." The irony was almost unbearable. The man who had condemned Kiboko to death was now offering to bankrupt himself to save the lion's life. Sarah stared at Morrison, trying to reconcile the contradictions. "Why?" she asked simply. Morrison looked at his hands, noting how they shook with what he now recognized as withdrawal symptoms from the anger that had sustained him for 15 years. "Because 3 days ago I watched that lion's family try to save him. They didn't give up, even when it was hopeless. They loved him enough to try everything." His voice cracked. "I never tried everything to save Michael. I just accepted the doctor's explanations and focused on finding someone to blame." The helicopter arrived at sunset, its rotors whipping the savanna grass into a frenzy as it touched down 50 yards from the acacia tree. The medical team that emerged was led by Dr. James Wainwright, a British surgeon who specialized in emergency procedures on large predators. Wainwright took one look at Kiboko's condition and shook his head grimly. "This is beyond risky," he told Sarah as they examined the unconscious lion. "The adhesive has bonded not just with his fur, but with the skin tissue. Removal will require microsurgery, and his dehydration makes anesthesia extremely dangerous. Honestly, the humane choice might be euthanasia." Morrison stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Doctor, I did this to him. If there's any chance to save his life, please try. I'll cover all costs, all risks, everything." The surgical procedure took place under portable floodlights as the African night settled around them. Morrison proved surprisingly useful as a surgical assistant, his steady hands and meticulous attention to detail serving him well. For 4 hours, the team worked to separate plastic from flesh, using specialized solvents and microsurgical techniques to preserve as much tissue as possible. At 11:43 p.m., disaster struck. Kiboko's heart monitor flatlined. Sarah immediately began cardiac massage, pressing her full weight against the lion's massive chest while Maria prepared emergency drugs. "Come on," Sarah whispered, sweat streaming down her face despite the cool night air. "Don't you dare give up now." Morrison stood frozen, watching death claim another life connected to his choices. In that moment he saw not just Kiboko dying, but Michael collapsing in the safari vehicle 15 years earlier. The same sense of helplessness, the same desperate need to do something, anything, to change the outcome. "Please," Morrison whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was praying to God or begging the lion. "Please don't let him die because of me." 30 seconds later, the monitor beeped. Then again. Kiboko's heart resumed its rhythm, weak but steady. The surgical team exchanged glances of relief and amazement, but the most profound change was in Morrison himself. As he watched life return to the animal he'd tried to kill, something fundamental shifted in his world view. The final complication arose as they prepared to remove the last section of plastic. The container had caused a fractured trachea, requiring an emergency tracheostomy to maintain Kiboko's airway. Dr. Wainwright hesitated, knowing that this procedure would leave permanent scarring and might affect Kiboko's ability to roar, a lion's primary form of communication. "Do it," Morrison said without hesitation. "If it means he lives, do it." At 6:20 a.m., as the sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, the final stitch was completed. Kiboko lay unconscious but stable, his breathing assisted by a temporary breathing tube. The plastic prison that had nearly killed him lay in pieces beside the surgical table, its malevolent purpose finally defeated. Morrison rode in the helicopter during transport to the Kenya Wildlife Service Medical Center, one hand resting gently on Kiboko's flank. For the first time in 15 years, he felt something other than anger. The emotion was unfamiliar, almost foreign. Hope. At the medical center, Morrison refused offers of hotel accommodations. Instead, he set up a sleeping bag in the back of his rented pickup truck, positioning it where he could see Kiboko's recovery enclosure. When staff members questioned his presence, he simply said, "I need to make sure he's okay." Days 5 through 7 were touch and go. Kiboko developed a secondary infection at the surgical site, requiring round-the-clock antibiotic treatment. Morrison volunteered for every shift, learning to prepare medications and assist with wound care. His presence initially disturbed some staff members, but his dedication gradually won their grudging respect. On day 8, Kiboko accepted his first solid food, raw meat hand-fed by Morrison, whose steady voice seemed to calm the recovering lion. "Easy, big guy," Morrison murmured, tears streaming down his face as Kiboko took tentative bites. "You're going to be okay. I promise you're going to be okay." The breakthrough came on day 10, when Kiboko stood for the first time. Morrison was alone in the enclosure, cleaning the water dish, when he heard movement behind him. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with 420 pounds of apex predator. For a moment that stretched into eternity, man and lion regarded each other. Morrison later described the moment to Sarah. "He looked at me, and I swear I could see forgiveness in his eyes, not because he understood what I'd done, but because forgiveness is just who he is." And I realized that's what I'd been missing all these years, the ability to forgive myself for not being able to save Michael. By day 12, Kiboko was attempting to purr when Morrison approached, a sound that reverberated through the medical center like distant thunder. The transformation in both man and lion was remarkable. Morrison had gained weight, his hands had stopped shaking, and for the first time since Michael's death, he was sleeping through the night. The question of Kiboko's future became the center of heated debate among the Kenya Wildlife Service staff. Traditional wisdom suggested that a lion so heavily exposed to human contact could never safely return to the wild. But Morrison had another idea, one that would require him to fundamentally alter the trajectory of his entire life. What if he didn't have to choose between captivity and the wild? Morrison asked Sarah during one of their evening conversations. What if there was a third option? Sarah studied Morrison's face, noting the profound changes that had occurred since that first day of surgery. The haunted, angry man who had confessed to torturing Kiboko had been replaced by someone she barely recognized, someone at peace with himself for the first time in decades. "What are you thinking, Derek?" Morrison looked through the fence at Kiboko, who was dozing in the late afternoon sun. "I'm thinking about staying in Kenya, setting up a foundation, funding research, making sure lions like Kiboko have advocates who understand that every life has value." He paused, his voice growing thoughtful. "I spent 15 years trying to destroy one lion's life. Maybe it's time I spent the rest of my life protecting others." 3 weeks after Kiboko's rescue, the international media discovered the story, and Derek Morrison's carefully guarded anonymity evaporated like morning mist in the African sun. CNN, BBC, and National Geographic descended on the Kenya Wildlife Service Center like vultures, transforming what had been a quiet healing space into a circus of reporters, cameras, and satellite trucks. The narrative they crafted was seductively simple. American tourist tortures, lion then saves it. But the reality, as Sarah Mitchell quickly learned, was infinitely more complex. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. Anonymous death threats arrived daily, addressed to Morrison at the Wildlife Center. Protesters gathered outside the facility with signs reading "Justice for Kiboko" and "Lock up the lion killer." Animal rights organizations demanded Morrison's immediate arrest and deportation, while others called for Kiboko to be relocated to a sanctuary far from his tormentor. The peaceful recovery environment that had allowed both man and lion to heal was shattered by the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Helen Morrison's arrival on September 25th added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. Sarah watched from the medical center's observation deck as a taxi discharged a woman who looked like she had been carved from granite by 15 years of grief and anger. Helen's first words to her estranged husband were delivered like body blows. "Derek, what have you done? The whole world thinks you're a monster." But Helen's fury began to crack as she witnessed Derek's transformation firsthand. She found him in Kiboko's enclosure at dawn, quietly cleaning the lion's water dish, while speaking in soft, reassuring tones to an animal that should have been his mortal enemy. The Derek she remembered, angry, obsessed, consumed by hatred, had been replaced by someone she barely recognized. This man moved with peace, spoke with kindness, and seemed to have found purpose in caring for the life he had nearly destroyed. "He talks to Kiboko about Michael," Helen confided to Sarah during one of their conversations in the center's small cafeteria. "Not with anger anymore, but with love. He tells the lion about our son's favorite books, his laugh, the way he used to collect rocks shaped like animals. It's like Derek is finally able to grieve properly instead of just rage." The legal proceedings began on October 1st, with Morrison's arrest by Kenyan authorities. The charges were severe: animal cruelty, illegal hunting activities, and violations of wildlife protection laws, carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison plus substantial fines. Morrison refused legal representation, insisting on pleading guilty to all charges despite the prosecutor's warnings about the consequences. International animal welfare organizations demanded the maximum penalty, But an unexpected voice emerged in Morrison's defense. Sarah Mitchell testified before the court about Morrison's role in Kiboko's recovery, describing his round-the-clock care, his emotional transformation, and his genuine commitment to conservation. "Your Honor," she said, "I've spent 8 years in wildlife conservation, and I've never seen someone work harder to save an animal's life than Derek Morrison has worked to save Kiboko's." The courtroom drama intensified when Helen Morrison took the stand. Her testimony revealed the hidden truth about Michael's death. The undiagnosed heart condition, the medical examiner's clear findings, and Derek's gradual descent into a fantasy narrative that blamed lions for a tragedy no one could have prevented. "My husband didn't torture that lion out of cruelty," Helen said, her voice breaking. "He tortured that lion out of pain. And watching him care for Kiboko has shown me that the man I married is still in there, buried under 15 years of grief." But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Wainwright, the British surgeon who had led Kiboko's emergency surgery, revealed information that stunned everyone in the courtroom. During our post-surgical analysis, we discovered something remarkable about this lion. Genetic testing revealed that Kiboko is not a pure African lion. He carries DNA from Asian lions, making him extraordinarily valuable for conservation breeding programs. The revelation sent shockwaves through the conservation community. Asian lions, with fewer than 600 individuals remaining in the wild, represented one of the world's most endangered subspecies. Kiboko's mixed genetics could potentially help strengthen the gene pool of both African and Asian lion populations. Morrison's target for revenge had turned out to be one of the most genetically valuable lions on the continent. This discovery led to another shocking revelation. Investigation into Kiboko's origins uncovered an international wildlife trafficking network that had been operating across East Africa for over a decade. The lion Morrison had hunted for 15 years wasn't even wild-born. He was a refugee from an illegal breeding operation that had been shut down when Kiboko was just a cub. Dr. Heinrich Volker, a German national posing as a conservation researcher, was arrested at Nairobi Airport while attempting to smuggle 2 lion cubs out of the country. Under interrogation, Volker revealed the scope of his operation. 47 lions had been bred in captivity and either sold to private hunting reserves or trafficked to collectors in Asia and the Middle East. Kiboko had escaped this fate only because of a police raid when he was 6 months old, leading to his adoption by the wild pride Morrison had observed. The irony was devastating. Morrison had spent 15 years hunting a lion that was actually a victim of human trafficking, not a wild predator. His quest for revenge had targeted an animal that had suffered more human cruelty in his first 6 months of life than most lions experience in their entire lifetimes. On October 15th, Judge Patricia Wanjiku delivered her verdict. Morrison was found guilty on all charges, but received a suspended sentence of 18 months plus 5 years probation, contingent on his continued involvement in wildlife conservation efforts. The judge's reasoning was both practical and philosophical. While Mr. Morrison's actions were reprehensible, his subsequent dedication to conservation and his unique understanding of the human psychology behind wildlife crime make him more valuable as an advocate than as a prisoner. The sentence sparked international debate. Animal rights groups denounced it as too lenient, while others praised it as an example of restorative rather than purely punitive justice. Morrison himself seemed almost disappointed by the relative leniency, having prepared himself for years in prison. "I deserved worse," he told Sarah after the verdict, "but I'll spend every day earning this second chance." The media attention had an unexpected positive effect. donations poured in from around the world to support Kiboko's care and the broader conservation efforts of the Kenya Wildlife Service. Within a month, over $2 million had been raised, funding not just Kiboko's ongoing medical needs, but also enhanced anti-poaching operations and community education programs throughout the Mara ecosystem. Morrison used the publicity to announce the establishment of the Michael Morrison Foundation for Wildlife Conservation, funded with the remainder of his personal savings and dedicated to preventing the kind of human-wildlife conflicts that had destroyed his family. Helen agreed to serve as the foundation's president, marking the first time the couple had worked together on anything since their son's death. But perhaps the most remarkable development came from Kiboko himself. As he continued to recover, the lion displayed behavioral changes that fascinated animal behaviorists. Despite his traumatic experience, Kiboko showed no aggression toward humans and seemed to actively seek out Morrison's presence. Dr. Rebecca Hassan, an animal psychologist from the University of Nairobi, observed their interactions with growing amazement. What we're seeing defies conventional understanding of predator psychology, Dr. Hassan explained to Sarah. Kiboko has formed what can only be described as a bond with the man who nearly killed him. It's as if he understands that Morrison has changed, that the threat has been replaced by protection. This bond became the foundation for an innovative conservation program. Morrison proposed establishing a research facility where Kiboko could live in semi-wild conditions while serving as an ambassador for lion conservation. The facility would study human-lion relationships, breed genetically valuable lions, and educate the public about the complex realities of wildlife conservation. The proposal faced significant opposition from traditionalists who argued that wild animals should remain in the wild period. But Sarah found herself supporting Morrison's vision, recognizing that Kiboko's unique circumstances made him unsuitable for complete release while potentially invaluable for conservation research. As October drew to a close, the question of Kiboko's future remained unresolved. The lion had reached full physical recovery, weighing a healthy 425 pounds and displaying all the majesty of an apex predator in his prime. But his emotional and psychological needs had become infinitely more complex than anyone had anticipated. The answer would come from an unexpected source, and it would challenge everything the conservation community thought they knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. The decision to attempt Kiboko's return to the wild came on November 3rd, driven by mounting pressure from international conservation groups who argued that no lion, regardless of circumstances, should live in permanent captivity. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found herself torn between her professional obligations and her growing understanding of Kiboko's unique psychological needs. The lion had recovered completely from his physical trauma, but his emotional relationship with humans, particularly Derek Morrison, had created an unprecedented situation in wildlife rehabilitation. The Kenya Wildlife Service's Board of Directors, responding to criticism that they were allowing sentiment to override scientific protocol, mandated that Kiboko undergo a standard reintroduction assessment. If he passed behavioral tests designed to measure his readiness for wild living, he would be released back to his original territory. The decision felt like a death sentence to Morrison, who had spent 6 weeks watching Kiboko thrive in a semi-captive environment. "They don't understand," Morrison confided to Helen during one of their evening walks around the facility. "Kiboko isn't just any lion anymore. What we've been through together has changed him, just like it changed me, forcing him back into a world that already rejected him once." His voice trailed off, but Helen understood the unspoken fear. Morrison had found redemption through caring for Kiboko. Losing the lion now would devastate the fragile peace he had constructed from the wreckage of his obsession. The reintroduction team, led by Dr. Marcus Ngozi from the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, arrived with sophisticated monitoring equipment and a meticulously planned protocol. Kiboko would be transported to a temporary holding area near his original pride's territory, then released under controlled conditions with GPS tracking and constant surveillance. The team's confidence was palpable. They had successfully reintroduced dozens of lions to the wild over the past decade. On November 8th, Kiboko was loaded into a specialized transport vehicle for the 2-hour journey to the release site. Morrison insisted on accompanying the convoy, despite Dr. Ngozi's reservations about the psychological impact on both man and lion. If something goes wrong, Morrison argued, Kiboko should see a familiar face, not strangers with tranquilizer guns. The release area was a carefully chosen section of the Masai Mara, where Kiboko's original pride had been spotted 3 days earlier. Camera traps confirmed the presence of Janai, the senior female who had made the heartbreaking decision to abandon Kiboko 7 weeks earlier, along with 2 other lionesses and 3 cubs. Notably absent was the pride's dominant male, a development that should have improved Kiboko's chances of acceptance. The temporary holding enclosure was positioned 400 yards from the pride's current location, close enough for visual and scent recognition but far enough to prevent immediate confrontation. Kiboko's reaction upon seeing his former territory was immediate and intense. He began pacing the enclosure's perimeter, emitting low vocalizations that carried across the savanna like thunder. Through binoculars, the research team could see the pride's ears perk up at the familiar sound. For 6 hours, an intricate dance of recognition played out across the grassland. Janai approached the enclosure cautiously, her body language displaying a complex mixture of curiosity, wariness, and what Dr. Hassan later described as apparent grief. The lioness circled the holding area multiple times, vocalizing responses to Kiboko's calls. The cubs, too young to remember their father clearly, showed interest, but remained safely behind their mother. At 2:15 p.m., Dr. Ngozi made the decision to open the enclosure. "Behavioral indicators are optimal," he announced to the observation team. "The pride is demonstrating acceptance patterns and Kiboko is showing appropriate submission signals." Morrison watched through binoculars as the gate swung open, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Kiboko emerged slowly, testing the air with his nostrils and scanning the horizon for threats. His first steps onto the open savanna were tentative, almost reverent, as if he were rediscovering a forgotten language of earth and grass and wind. For 20 minutes, he moved steadily toward his former pride, stopping frequently to mark territory and vocalize his presence. The reunion with Janai was everything the research team had hoped for. The lioness approached Kiboko with obvious recognition, touching noses in the greeting ritual that had marked their relationship for years. The other pride members joined gradually, rubbing against Kiboko's flanks and purring their welcome. Morrison found himself crying as he watched the family restore itself, each gesture of acceptance feeling like a benediction on his own journey toward redemption. But at 3:47 p.m., everything changed. A vehicle approached the observation area, tourists who had somehow learned about the release and driven off-road to witness the historic moment. The sound of the engine, combined with the sight of humans, triggered an unexpected response in Kiboko. Instead of fleeing or showing aggression, the lion did something that stunned every member of the research team. He abandoned his pride and began walking directly toward the vehicle, his posture relaxed and welcoming. Morrison watched in horror as Kiboko approached the tourists with the same trust and affection he had shown toward his human caregivers. "My God," Dr. Ngozi whispered. "He's been too humanized. He sees people as members of his pride now." The tragic irony was complete. Morrison's attempt to destroy Kiboko had instead created a lion who could never safely coexist with either humans or his own species. The revelation that changed everything came not from the Kenyan authorities or the international conservation community, but from a faded manila folder buried in the archives of a Botswana hospital. Helen Morrison had spent 3 sleepless nights after Kiboko's failed reintroduction, haunted by her husband's devastation and driven by a growing suspicion that had been gnawing at her for 15 years. On November 12th, she made a series of phone calls that would unravel the foundation of Derek's obsession and expose a truth more devastating than any lie. Dr. Patricia Molefe, the emergency room physician who had treated 8-year-old Michael Morrison in 2008, was initially reluctant to discuss a case from so long ago. But Helen's persistence, combined with her own medical background as a former nurse, eventually convinced Dr. Molefe to review the archived medical records. What she found contradicted the narrative that had consumed Derek Morrison's life for a decade and a half. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Molefe said during their video call, her voice gentle but firm, "your son did not die from fright or shock related to the lions. Michael suffered a massive cardiac arrest caused by hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a genetic condition that makes the heart muscle abnormally thick. The autopsy revealed extensive scarring in his heart tissue, indicating this condition had been present for years. He could have died at any moment, playing soccer, climbing stairs, or simply sleeping." Helen felt the room spinning as Dr. Molefe continued. "The timing of his collapse during the safari was purely coincidental. The lions had nothing to do with Michael's death. In fact, according to the safari guide's report, the Pride was approximately 200 meters away and showing no aggressive behavior when Michael collapsed. The medical records painted a picture of tragic inevitability. Michael had been born with a genetic time bomb that neither parent knew existed." Family histories revealed that Derek's father had died of heart failure at age 32, likely the same undiagnosed condition. The lions Derek had blamed for 15 years were innocent of everything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Helen's next call was to Sarah Mitchell, and the conversation that followed would reshape everything they thought they knew about Derek's journey. "Sarah, Derek has been hunting an innocent animal for 15 years based on a delusion. The lions didn't kill Michael. His heart killed him, and it would have killed him whether we were in Africa or sitting in our living room in Denver." Sarah absorbed this information with the careful precision of someone trained to analyze complex medical situations. "Helen, this explains so much about Derek's psychological profile. He created a narrative that gave meaning to meaningless tragedy. But now we have to decide, do we tell him? And if we do, how do we tell a man who has just found peace that his entire quest was based on a lie?" The ethical dilemma was staggering. Derek Morrison had finally found redemption through his care for Kiboko, had rebuilt his marriage and discovered purpose in conservation work. Learning that his 15-year obsession was based on false premises might destroy the fragile psychological equilibrium he had achieved. But living with the truth while allowing Derek to continue believing a lie seemed equally unconscionable. Helen made the decision that would define the next phase of their lives. She flew back to Kenya and requested a private meeting with Derek in the Kenya Wildlife Service's small conference room. As she spread Michael's medical records across the table, she watched her husband's face transform from confusion to disbelief to a kind of hollow devastation that was worse than anger. "You're telling me," Derek said, his voice barely a whisper, "that I spent our retirement savings, destroyed our marriage, and nearly killed an innocent animal because I couldn't accept that sometimes children just die?" Helen reached across the table to take his hand. "Derek, you spent 15 years trying to make sense of the senseless. Michael's death wasn't anyone's fault. Not the lions, not the doctors, not ours. Sometimes terrible things just happen. and we have to find a way to live with that." Derek stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking Kiboko's enclosure. The lion was resting in the afternoon shade, his magnificent form a living reminder of how close hatred had come to destroying beauty. For 10 minutes, Derek said nothing, and Helen watched her husband process the collapse of the worldview that had sustained him through 15 years of grief. "I need to see him," Derek finally said. "I need to tell Kiboko what I've learned." What followed was one of the most extraordinary conversations Sarah Mitchell had ever witnessed. Derek entered Kiboko's enclosure and sat cross-legged on the ground, speaking in the same gentle tones he had used during the lion's recovery. But now his words carried a different weight, the weight of truth and confession. "I'm sorry, my friend," Derek whispered, as Kiboko approached and settled beside him with the trust that had astonished the research community. "I blamed you for something you never did. Michael died because of a broken heart. His, not yours. You were just trying to live your life, raise your family, be the magnificent creature you are. And I made you suffer for my inability to accept reality." Kiboko's response was to rest his massive head on Derek's lap, a gesture of forgiveness that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. In that moment, the symbolic relationship between man and lion transcended the specific circumstances of their meeting. Derek had found in Kiboko not just a target for revenge, but a teacher of grace. The revelation about Michael's true cause of death led to another shocking discovery. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, driven by her own need to understand the full scope of what had transpired, began investigating the broader context of Derek's 15-year hunt. What she found revealed a darker truth about the wildlife trafficking network that had shaped Kiboko's early life. Heinrich Volker, the German trafficker currently awaiting trial in Nairobi, had not been operating independently. His network included corrupt officials within multiple African wildlife services, private hunting reserves that laundered trafficked animals, and wealthy collectors who purchased exotic predators with the same casual attitude others might buy art. Kiboko had been saved from this network by chance, a police raid that freed him when he was just 6 months old, but dozens of other lions had not been so fortunate. The investigation revealed that several of the lions Derek had previously tracked during his 15-year obsession had actually been trafficked animals, not wild-born predators. His meticulous documentation of lion movements and behaviors had inadvertently created one of the most comprehensive databases of illegal wildlife trafficking patterns in East Africa. The very obsession that had nearly destroyed his life had generated information that could help authorities dismantle criminal networks across the continent. On November 20th, Derek made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He formally requested that all his research, 15 years of photographs, GPS coordinates, behavioral observations, and financial records, be turned over to international law enforcement agencies investigating wildlife trafficking. The data that had been gathered in service of revenge would now serve justice. "I spent 15 years being wrong about one lion," Derek told the assembled investigators. "But maybe that 15 years of being wrong can help us be right about saving hundreds of others." The psychological transformation was complete, but the practical challenges remained daunting. Kiboko could neither return to the wild nor live safely among humans, his behavioral conditioning having created an impossible middle ground. The lion existed in a liminal space between wildness and domestication, much like Derek himself existed between his past as a man consumed by hatred and his future as an advocate for the creatures he had once hunted. Sarah proposed a solution that would honor both Kiboko's unique circumstances and Derek's need for redemption. The Morrison Foundation for Wildlife Conservation would establish a research facility where Kiboko could live in conditions that approximated the wild while serving as an ambassador for conservation education. Derek would dedicate his remaining years to studying human-wildlife relationships, using his own story as a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of grief and wildlife conflict. The proposal faced significant opposition from traditionalist conservationists who argued that no wild animal should be maintained in permanent captivity, regardless of circumstances. But Sarah's advocacy, combined with the unique educational value of Kiboko's story, gradually built support for what became known as the Kiboko Protocol, a framework for managing wildlife that had been psychologically impacted by human interaction. As November drew to a close, Derek Morrison faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could return to Denver and attempt to rebuild a normal existence, or he could remain in Kenya and dedicate himself to ensuring that no other families would suffer the kind of tragedy that had shaped his past 15 years. The answer came from an unexpected source, a letter from his wife that would reshape everything once again. Helen Morrison's letter arrived on November 28th, handwritten on hotel stationery in her careful script, and it would prove to be the final catalyst in Derek's transformation. Sarah found him reading it in the early morning light beside Kiboko's enclosure, tears streaming down his weathered face as the lion dozed peacefully in the corner. The letter was brief but devastating in its honesty. "Derek, I came to Kenya expecting to bring home the man I married 30 years ago. Instead, I found someone better, someone Michael would be proud to call his father. I'm not asking you to choose between your old life and your new purpose. I'm asking you to let me choose to be part of both." The decision to establish the Kiboko Conservation Center became official on December 1, 2023, when Derek signed papers transferring his remaining assets, approximately $150,000, to purchase 400 acres of land adjacent to the Masai Mara National Reserve. Helen had liquidated their house in Denver, adding another $280,000 to the fund, making a statement that stunned their adult children and former neighbors. "We're not running away from Michael's memory," she told their daughter Jennifer during a video call. "We're finally running towards something meaningful." The land purchase included a modest farmhouse that Derek and Helen converted into their permanent residence, marking the first time in 3 years that the couple had shared a home. More importantly, it included natural habitat that could accommodate Kiboko's need for space while maintaining the controlled environment necessary for his unique circumstances. Local Maasai communities, initially skeptical of another American conservation project, gradually embraced the initiative when Derek hired 12 community members as rangers and educators. Kiboko's transition to his new home was remarkably smooth, suggesting that his earlier failed reintroduction had less to do with his capacity for semi-wild living and more to do with the specific trauma of being separated from Derek. The lion established territorial markers within his new enclosure, demonstrated hunting behaviors with provided prey, and even began vocalizing the long-distance calls that wild lions use to communicate across vast territories. Yet he continued to seek daily interaction with Derek, a behavioral pattern that fascinated visiting researchers. Dr. Rebecca Hassan, the animal psychologist who had been studying Kiboko since his rescue, published a groundbreaking paper in the Journal of Applied Animal Behavior about what she termed interspecies trauma bonding. Her research suggested that Kiboko's attachment to Derek represented a genuine psychological phenomenon rather than simple conditioning. "What we're observing, Doctor." Hassan explained to a gathering of international conservation experts, challenges fundamental assumptions about the capacity for emotional relationships between humans and apex predators. The Kiboko Conservation Center formally opened to visitors on February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day, a date Helen chose for its symbolic significance. "Love saved both of them," she told the assembled crowd of journalists, researchers, and local officials. "It seems appropriate to celebrate that." The center's mission statement, written jointly by Derek and Sarah Mitchell, committed to three primary goals: advancing research on human-wildlife conflict resolution, educating the public about conservation complexity, and providing sanctuary for animals whose circumstances prevented traditional reintroduction. Derek's role as the center's director required him to tell his story hundreds of times to visiting groups, school children, and documentary filmmakers. Each retelling served as both education and therapy, forcing him to confront repeatedly the psychological journey that had brought him from hunter to protector. "I spent 15 years learning how to hate," he would tell audiences. Kiboko, visible in the background. "It took one dying lion to teach me how to love again." The center's impact extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Within 6 months, it had hosted researchers from 12 countries studying everything from PTSD and wildlife to the ethics of conservation intervention. The Kiboko Protocol, Guidelines for Managing Psychologically Impacted Wildlife, was adopted by conservation organizations across Africa and eventually incorporated into international wildlife management standards. Perhaps most remarkably, Kiboko began displaying behaviors that suggested he understood his role as an educator. During scheduled feeding demonstrations, he would position himself in full view of visitors, allowing photographers and filmmakers to capture images that became iconic representations of conservation success. When children visited the center, Kiboko showed particular interest, often approaching the viewing area and lying down where young visitors could observe him safely. Derek's relationship with Michael's memory also underwent profound transformation. Instead of the bitter grief that had consumed him for 15 years, he began speaking about his son with joy and pride. He established a scholarship fund in Michael's name for Kenyan students pursuing wildlife conservation degrees, and he frequently told visitors how Michael's excitement about animals had inspired the family's African safari. "My son loved lions," Derek would say, watching Kiboko through the enclosure fence. "I think he would have loved knowing that his death, even though it wasn't caused by lions, eventually led to saving one." On June 15, 2024, Michael's birthday, Derek and Helen held the first annual Michael Morrison Memorial Conservation Conference at the center. The 3-day event brought together researchers, policymakers, and community leaders to address human-wildlife conflict across Africa. The conference's keynote speaker was Derek himself, delivering a presentation titled "When Grief Becomes Purpose: A Personal Journey from Revenge to Redemption." The most powerful moment of the conference came when Samurai Kiptanui, a 12-year-old Maasai boy whose family lived near the center, stood up during Derek's presentation and asked a question that silenced the room. "Mr. Derek, do you think Kiboko forgives you?" Derek looked through the window at the lion, who was resting in his favorite spot beneath an acacia tree, then back at the young boy. "Samurai, I think Kiboko taught me that forgiveness isn't something you receive, it's something you become. And every day I spend caring for him is another day I learn how to forgive myself." The center's success attracted international attention and funding, but Derek and Helen remained committed to keeping the operation modest and manageable. They refused offers from major zoos to purchase Kiboko, turned down movie deals that would have dramatized their story, and declined opportunities to franchise the concept. "This isn't about building an empire," Helen explained to potential investors. "It's about proving that individual actions can create meaningful change." By December 2024, exactly 1 year after the center's establishment, Kiboko had sired 3 cubs with Kessie, a rescued lioness who had been traumatized by poachers. The births represented both biological success and symbolic completion, life emerging from the partnership between the man who had once sought death and the lion who had taught him about life. Derek named the cubs Michael, Hope, and Janai, honoring his son, their shared journey, and the lioness who had first shown Kiboko the meaning of family. Sarah Mitchell, who had been promoted to Regional Director of Wildlife Conservation for East Africa, delivered the benediction at the center's first anniversary celebration. "A year ago, we thought we were saving one lion's life," she said, as Derek and Helen stood hand in hand beside Kiboko's enclosure. "What we discovered was that sometimes, saving one life becomes the beginning of saving many lives, including our own." As the sun set over the Masai Mara on that anniversary evening, Derek Morrison sat beside Kiboko's enclosure, reading aloud from a children's book about African animals, the same book he had read to Michael 15 years earlier. Kiboko listened attentively, occasionally responding with soft rumbles that sounded remarkably like contentment. In the distance, wild lions called to each other across the savannah, their voices carrying stories of survival, family, and the eternal dance between predator and prey. Derek closed the book and looked at his unlikely friend. "You know what, old boy? I think we both found our way home." Kiboko's response was a deep, resonant purr that vibrated through the African night, a sound of peace, forgiveness, and hope for tomorrow. Sometimes the very thing that breaks us becomes what teaches us how to heal, not just ourselves, but the world around us. Dear friends, if you're between 55 and 68, you know that life has a way of breaking us in ways we never expected. Maybe you've lost someone precious, felt consumed by anger you couldn't shake, or wondered if your best years are behind you. Derek Morrison's story reminds us that it's never too late for redemption. At 58, he was a broken man who had spent 15 years letting grief poison his soul. But sometimes, rock bottom becomes the foundation for rebuilding something beautiful. Through caring for Kiboko, the very lion he had tried to destroy, Derek discovered that healing doesn't come from revenge or dwelling in past pain. It comes from choosing love over hate, purpose over bitterness, and service over self-pity. His marriage was restored, his heart found peace, and his remaining years gained profound meaning. Helen's courage to join him in Kenya proves that couples can rediscover each other even after decades of distance. Your story isn't over. Whether you're facing retirement, loss, or simply feeling invisible in a youth-obsessed world, remember that your greatest chapters might still be unwritten. Like Derek, you have time to transform pain into purpose. What loss or regret in your life could become your greatest source of meaning? Have you ever experienced a moment when helping someone else helped heal your own heart? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.